Okay. Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. It's 7:05. We're on Mayo time, as Cormac tells me. Welcome, everyone. I'm Kevin Kenny, Director of the Ireland House. This is such a special evening for us. Two of our closest friends and members of the community in conversation about the new biography of Ernie O'Malley. Loretta is here. Whenever Loretta is here, I welcome you, and it's so great to see you and to see us back together on a Thursday evening schedule at last. A busy Thursday evening. We're here to celebrate the launch of Ernie O'Malley, A Life, co-authored by Harry Martin and, of course, Ernie's son, Cormac O'Malley, published earlier this year by Merriam Press. And Cormac will be in conversation with Ted Smyth. Probably the first 20-30 minutes. We'll see how it goes. If you find it boring, just interrupt, because this is an interactive evening. We'll run probably for like 15 or so. We don't have our usual post-lecture reception. We're not quite there yet. I am told that Swift's around the corner is the place to be, so I think some of us will be there later. I do want to introduce both Cormac and Ted in some detail. Everybody knows you, but I want to just introduce our speakers this evening. Born in Newport, County Mayo, west of the Shannon, Cormac came to the United States when his father died, lived with his mother, Helen Hooker, in Connecticut. Much of her artwork around us this evening. After attending Harvard College, where he wrote his senior thesis on Irish history, Cormac served with the US Navy in the Western Pacific. He took his law degree at Columbia and went on to an illustrious career in international and corporate law, based in Mexico, Brussels, London, New York, and elsewhere. After retirement, I believe in 1999, I have the bio correct, Cormac continued to work as an international consultant while devoting more and more of his time to his family's heritage. We're celebrating this evening. Among many other leadership positions, he served as president of the Board of Advisors here in Blackstone Ireland House, which is when we would first met when I was coming down here to launch my books from Boston over the years, and as a board member of the Irish American Cultural Institute. Cormac has done so much in curating and donating both the artwork and his father's papers to us here at NYU, also to the archives at University College Dublin. He also endowed the Cormac O'Malley lecture series in 1999, so we're coming up on 25, or maybe past right. I'm not good at dates as a historian, but every year. And coming up in March, Tyler Anbinder will be here in the house for the next O'Malley lecture, talking about surprising levels of social mobility among families here in New York City. Ted Smyth is our current president of the advisory board, also chair of the advisory board of the Clinton Institute. Ted is native of County Meath, graduate of Trinity College Dublin, became a diplomat in 50 years ago, served as a delegate to the East-West Conference on Security and Cooperation in Geneva, as first secretary at the embassy in Lisbon during the Portuguese Revolution, actually in 1975, head of press information back in Dublin, deputy head of government information services, member of the Secretariat of the forum, of course, about historic agreement bringing peace to the island. Ted took a leave of absence in 1988 to join the global food company H.J. Heinz in Pittsburgh, embarked on a new phase of his career, came to New York City in 2009, and was executive vice president of Wall Hill, from which he retired in 2015. Clearly, when you retire, you really get to work, as we say with Cormac and Ted. Ted actually came here to Blackman Ireland House and took his MA in Irish American Studies in our program. Great triumph coming with that is to publish the heart of that thesis, the ethnic history. Ted publishes frequently, as you know, writes for the Irish Times, for Irish Central, continues to write on Twitter, as long as we have Twitter, and maybe not writing to Castlebar with me, we should talk about that. So, look, welcome.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for that very generous introduction. I feel like Cormac and I are living history to people in this room. We weren't quite born in the 18th century, but we're aspiring. It is truly amazing to think that we have here in Cormac the son of a general in the Irish War of Independence 100 years ago. That's really quite remarkable. And it's a great privilege for me to be talking to Cormac about his legendary father. You know, Roy Foster, in his tribute to this new book here, by Harry and by Cormac, writes, Ernie O'Malley's perennially interesting life is part of the drama of Irish history. Tonight we'll trace Ernie's extraordinary journey from legendary gunman to acclaimed writer and champion of the Irish arts. You know, it's also a love story when Ernie meets Helen Hooker, an American but an equally independent, free spirit, and an artist as well. Tonight is also an additional opportunity for Glucksman Ireland House to mark the centenary of the War of Independence, the establishment of the Irish state, and the Civil War. And actually it's worth noting in that context that one of our members is Erskine Childers, whose great-grandfather was executed by the Irish Free State 100 years ago, virtually on this date, November 24, if I had that right. So let's jump right into it, Cormac. What made a medical student in Dublin, whose father worked for the British Crown, and whose brother was an officer in the British Army, join the war against British rule in Ireland?
Well, I think it was an emotional one, clearly different from the family background. But what happened on Easter Monday in 1916 was he was down at his, it was a holiday, but he was still down with his buddies in city centre Dublin. And he read the Proclamation of Independence on Sackville Street, then later as O'Connell Street. And the way I tell the story, he was very moved by the words that Ireland should be for the Irish. I mean, these are simple words, but good words, and quite dramatic. They come directly from the proclamation of independence. And he went home, he was so moved, he went home that night, met a friend on the way home, and decided that they should pick up a gun and go fight the British. He had never been part of the Irish Volunteers, which had been started a couple of years before. He just took the gun and went down to the Liffey, and as he saw troops coming down the quays, he started shooting, and and he did that for the next couple of nights. So it was what I would call an epiphany, a turning point in his career. Obviously, he couldn't talk about what he'd done the night before at the breakfast table next morning, and he, of course, had to get up on time to get to medical school. And for the next 8 years, he was really living a duplicitous life, not telling his family what he was doing. Well, they knew when he left home 2 years later, but until then, it was a secret life of Ernie O'Malley.
So in your book, you talk about the influence of the Christian Brothers School in teaching nationalism, which would have been new to him coming from a more Victorian family. I guess that was a fact. I also think of Frank McCourt's line in his Teacher Man, where he says the purpose of young people is to push old people aside. I have to be very wary about young people. Was that a factor, do you think, that Ernie was going out on his own?
Well, the whole movement was a young movement. And even within, there were people who, the home rulers, home rulers were satisfied with home rule. So home rulers had to be pushed out of their warm seats by the IRB, Irish Republican Brotherhood, and the Sinn Féin developers, and those Irish volunteers who remained at home after the 1914 split, when 90% went to fight for the empire, 10% stayed at home. So there was a whole new movement, and the IRA movement, the Irish Volunteers, there were occasionally older people, but I mean, I dare say most of them were under 30. And father at that time was 21. They were fighting the establishment within their own families and within the relatively staid community of Ireland. And if you recall, the reaction by the Irish in Dublin in 1916 was, what are these hotheads about? They're ruining the opera that afternoon, or the racehorses that would have been done. And the Irish people were very much against the 1916 at the time.
So let's just jump to this next slide, because he was captured during the War of Independence and tortured. And we have a slide up here of his mugshot at Kilmainham Jail, and I guess they didn't know his real name. You want to just talk about that?
So yeah, he went on the run in 1918, reported into Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy, and they sent him around Ireland. He sort of fought and organized in about 18 different brigade areas, and one of his last assignments was to go down to Kilkenny. And Mulcahy said, we will give you the 1st Southern Division, which was going to be all of Liam Lynch's, Ernie O'Malley's, and the 1st Southern Division, the 3rd Southern Division. Anyway, before that, take care of the new auxiliaries who had moved into Enriched and in the house down there. And actually, he failed to do that. And he was captured near Enriched, brought up to Dublin, and had a good working over. He was tortured, and he was shown the same cell that Father McKee had been tortured and shot just 2 weeks before. Father Campsey and McKee. And so the same people who had brutalized the 3 lads before turned on Father, and there was the red-hot poker treatment on the eyeballs, and the false shooting pistol. And he was, they couldn't get anything out of him. And so they, it is ironic that he wasn't shot, but since he wasn't known, they only shot people that they knew that should be shot. And so he was sent out to Kilmainham, and the minute he got to Kilmainham, somebody put a piece of paper under the door, and his own papers and papers of Michael Collins had been captured on December 30th, 1920. And the name, the new IRA leader, E. Malia, was identified. And somebody slipped this piece of paper under Father's cell. So he said, I better get out of here before I get shot, because now I'm known. First of all, whoever slipped the paper under them knew him. And so Michael Collins helped engineer getting him out of Kilmainham.
And just putting up the shot here, the report of his escape from Kilmainham Jail. The O'Malley Gate. Has it been named for him since?
Yes, indeed. So that was the O'Malley gate was, and I've seen, we'll have an exhibition back in Kilmainham because it's the 102nd anniversary next February 14th. He went out on Valentine's Day, and the IRA had arranged for a couple of ladies to entertain some soldiers around that area with the appropriate cuddles as the men snuck out from the O'Malley gate. And he had cut with both cutters, which had been slipped into by some Welsh guards into his cell. And the three people were able to escape at that time.
So, I'm going to take questions from all of you. I know you'll probably want to explore this War of Independence, but I'd like to just move quickly now to the Civil War, a less happy episode indeed for the Irish, where it would appear that Michael Collins had succeeded in getting the freedom to achieve freedom. The guns were being handed over, Dublin Castle was being handed over to the Irish, and the Irish cabinet and the Dáil narrowly ratified that treaty with London, but a number of people, including Ernie, couldn't take it and decided to oppose it. And I guess my question to you is, why did Ernie oppose Michael Collins in this, and did he ever have doubts about it afterwards?
He tells a very moving story in his book, The Singing Flame, of how he just, when he read that newspaper on the morning of the 8th of December in Limerick, I think it was down in Limerick, and he just burst into tears. And I've done research on all of his handwritten notes, and guess what? There's no note for December 7, 8, or 9. So I think he was just despondent about the betrayal. Now, betrayal is a strong word, but it was certainly used by those people in the, let's say, the southern half of Ireland, which was very Republican, and in Mayo, where, there was, the people did not go pro-treaty. And Fowler just felt that, giving away the Republic, no matter how unrealistic it might have been, because the 6 counties had already been given away, but had taken an oath to a foreign king when they had to have their republic for 2 years, having the possession of their ports be retained, having to pay for the RIC and annuities. There were a whole series of little things that just struck these people that this is not what they had thought.
And then De Valera didn't go to London to negotiate this famously. Went out and denounced the treaty around the country, and in many ways stirred up these passions and added them somewhat more. I grew up in a family that was very pro-treaty, and of course you're either for Collins or you were for De Valera in Ireland in growing up, and we were very much pro-Collins and anti-De Valera, and that was the division in Ireland for many years, in Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And so it really seems such a tragedy that brother and brother were, falling out with each other. I still wonder, could the split have been, if, for example, Collins had come back from London during the negotiations during that fall and said, look, frankly, our tank is empty in the IRA. We don't have enough munitions. This is a good deal. If he'd gone around the country talking to people in Munster and not just stayed in London and then said, okay, here's the deal, would that have helped?
Well, there are a lot of things that might have happened had he done a tour.
Yeah.
He could well have been shot. These were people who, Father, first of all, didn't know why there was a truce, because the Republicans and who became anti-treaty felt, rightly or wrongly, that they had the RIC and the Brits on the run. Namely, I think it was not a very good analysis, but the RIC were retreating from the top of the hills down to the main towns. 400 barracks had been blown up. Well, actually, what happened was about 50 were blown up and 350 were evacuated and then burned by the IRA. So to try to convince an Ernie O'Malley or a Liam Lynch that they were they were going to run out of ammunition would have been a very difficult task. Richard Mulcahy knew what the armament was because he got these weekly reports in Dublin. And I dare say his mentality was that, yeah, we're running out of fuel. Now, Collins did not negotiate with his generals before the truce, and I think that would have been the time to tell them. And he didn't go around during the treaty negotiations, which again would have been the time. How successful that would have been, it's really potluck as to whether you can say it would have been successful. Because the people whom he needed to get on his side were just, Fenians. Fenians were Fenians, and they remain Fenians.
Yeah. Okay, well, and then we have a slide up here about his hunger strike. I guess he was captured and shot pretty badly during the Civil War.
So, Father had responsibility on Lynch for half of Ireland at the age of 25. So he had all of Ulster and all of Leinster. And he was holed up in the headquarters in Dublin. And I made a movie some years ago under the title Hidden Room. And it was in the O'Rahilly home on Aylesbury Road. And he was captured there and famously said, "Will you surrender?" And he ran down the stairs, threw a grenade and said, "No surrender here." He was captured, heavily wounded, and despite his wounds, when a hunger strike was called by the IRA in October of 1923, he went on a 41-day hunger strike. And so this poster represents outside people making publicity, as throughout history, the people on the outside of the jail do the publicity and get people to run. He had been appointed by the Sinn Féin seat to run for Parliament. And this is sort of the publicity that they did.
And he would have been executed, perhaps, if he hadn't been shot 9 times?
Yes, so definitely. I mean, when you think of what was happening in November 1922, Father was arrested on the 4th. Erskine Childers was arrested on the 17th or 10th and executed on the 24th. And so the Free State had just issued a declaration that anyone caught with a gun could be subject to execution. So Ernie O'Malley not only had a gun on him when he was captured, but he had just shot a Free State soldier. But because of the death of James Connolly in 1916, when he was sort of tied up in a chair, the Free State were very conscious of the bad press that the English got. And I think they learned their lesson there, and they did not execute Ernie O'Malley. They put him on trial, and they were going to put him on trial, but because of his own penchant for publicity, he snuck letters out to the press, and again, the charges were dropped.
So let's, so the anti-treaty side lost in the war, and it was a very tough time for your father. And you write in the book about him going to Europe, I guess, in an attempt to reinvent himself, to recover from undoubted amounts of PTSD. And we have a slide up here about him in the Pyrenees. Talk a little bit about that period and that sort of regeneration.
So when he got out of jail in July 1924, one of the real reasons the Free State wanted to make sure that all the jails were empty at that time was the Tailteanna Games were coming up in August of that year, and they wanted to have no local issue with people in jail. So they were very fortunate that those games came around, because in fact the jails were empty. Father was one of the last people to get out of jail, but he was really an injured person, both in spiritually as well as physically. And he decided to go to Europe. He collected some money from friends from the White Cross, which was an American invention, brought over to the Red Cross. It became the White Cross in Ireland. And he got loans from them and went to Europe to recover. Went down to Barcelona. And his feet had been so injured by the British that he needed to get special boots made in order that his feet could fit into a shoe and climb. And he started climbing the Pyrenees. And I have yet an unpublished book on the Pyrenees, which might come out one of these days. But and while he was down there, of course, he went to help the Catalans and the Basques, who were the only republic that recognized the Irish Republic of 1919 was the Basque Republic. Not a very well-known fact. So he went and talked to them and helped their movements. We don't know too much about that because clearly that was something that he wouldn't commit to paper. But he was down there, and he was there for about a year and a half, wandering around Italy and France, and he got into significant reading of international drama that he wanted to bring back to Ireland when he founded the Dramatic Society at UCD when he returned in 26. But also art became an even more important part of his world because we have the diaries, they're here at the New York University, of the churches and the museums and the other materials that cultural institutions that he saw walking through Italy and France, Germany and Holland.
So it was a remarkable awakening of his artistic interests, and this was to mark his life for the next many years. And now we could switch to America. He got an opportunity to go to America when De Valera asked him to do some fundraising for the Irish Press newspaper, right?
Yeah, in 1928, Father was not doing well in medical school, and he was quite disillusioned with the whole process, and it became known, I guess, and De Valera had the idea. De Valera had been over here raising funds for different causes over the years, and said he wanted to create this Irish press. So he sent his two generals, who were Ernie O'Malley and Frank Aiken, and one took the west side of America, and Father took the east side, and then they switched roles. And they managed to raise about $500,000, which is an amazing sum in those days, from Irish-American sources. In the course of that, Father also got to not only meet the Irish-American community, with which he was not very satisfied in the sense that he couldn't have discussions in that community the way that he would like to have discussions. But by the time he hit the West Coast and saw the museums and met various people like Edward Weston and Paul Strand and Ford and Ella Young, he was moving into an arts world. And so he had made a commitment not to go back to medical school, but to have the rest of his life in the arts.
And this is a remarkable photograph by the renowned photographer Paul Strand, who, with Stieglitz and others, is the preeminent photographer of the period. Very striking portrait. And I guess we'll turn quickly to the next phase, which is the romance. He meets this extraordinarily beautiful and talented artist, Helen Hooker, and these busts around here are by her, and there's some others over there too. And this book here, Western Ways, carries her photography that she did with Ernie and her own photography. So there were two independent spirits. Talk a little bit about about that period.
So, Father had returned to the East Coast from the West. He's looking at some of his poems today at NYU, and you could see this theme that he wanted to get back to Ireland. His poetry reminded him of the hills of Mayo and the downs of Wicklow. Anyway, so he also wanted to publish his book. and he wanted to complete his book. He had been working on that since 1929, so 3 years in he hadn't completed it. He came back to the East Coast, and Paul Strand helped him get into Yada Foundation up in Saratoga Springs. And he was able to basically complete the book in the next 2 years. And during the course of the period in 1933, met Helen Hooker. And he also got a job out at Chicago. And she went out to see him. All he said was, I'll be in Chicago at the World's Fair. So she went out to Chicago to check up with this redhead, good-looking man, and she went to the Irish Pavilion and met him, and they sort of struck up some conversation, and she said she'd love to do his head when he gets back to New York. So the head became an issue between them in the sense that we needed an appointment, get to her apartment, to have dinner, and God knows what else went on. But, this was the 30s, and she was still a rather proper lady. So, but over the course of the next 2 years, clearly, she dropped the guy she was going with and picked Ernie. And by 1935, he had, unfortunately, received a lot of negatives on the publication of his book. But he thought if he went back home to Ireland, he could not only get a pension from the De Valera government, who had brought in legislation in 1932 and 3 to give pensions to the fighters for the freedom, but also, have enough money to get married on and to publish his book.
And this slide just talks about how the book was serialized in the Irish press in 1936 to great acclaim. And extraordinary book. I highly recommend it. This book and On Another Man's Wound to any of you who haven't read it. So, Cormac O'Malley comes along in 1942, the third child of that marriage, and you live in Mayo early on, and interesting bit of childhood. And maybe we'll just take a break at this stage and open it up for questions to you. So we have other parts of the story to tell, but I just wanted to give you all an opportunity to make some comments or questions. I think we have a mic here if anybody is so inclined. Is there a mic going around? Sure, absolutely. Question.
I'll repeat it.
The title.
So
the question is why the title, right?
The question is the title of the two books that my father wrote. He only published one during his lifetime, which was On Another Man's Wound. And that comes from an Ulster expression, which is, it's easy to sleep on another man's wound. Now, one could think, why would an author publish that title in 1935? And who was sleeping on whose wound? And who had been wounded? And who had gotten into power? And who had taken an oath? And who hadn't taken an oath? So, I mean, there's a lot of ramifications from that. The second title, The Singing Flame, many people suggest it's either singing or singeing flame. And there was a hissing sound coming out of the portal in the jails that Paula was in, including in the Civil War, where the gas, as it came out, made a hissing sound. And I've heard it, that was what he intended. Never talked to my father, didn't actually find that manuscript until 15 years after his death. So wasn't able to ask him.
Kevin.
they didn't always get along, right? There's a generation divide there as well. So in your life and work, Cormac, how has generation figured into memories of Ernie O'Malley and memories of the struggle, memories of the Civil War? Has that been an issue that has come up as time passed?
And I think to elaborate on that, I mean, the first son got the land and the second son didn't, or the third son, so they were in some ways, I think you pointed this out, rivals.
Well, I certainly I can't comment knowledgeably about whether the generational difference that I expressed concerning 1916 was true in 1922 or 23. I mean, I think it continued, but I don't know as the pro-treaty people were older than the anti-treaty people. I think what happened in the Civil War, and it's happened in many civil wars, which you have colorful leaders who say, lads, we're going this way, and the troops follow them. So whatever age the leaders were, and if you look at the map of Ireland in 1922, you can see that the divisions that had been created by the IRA, by Collins in 1921, were split almost equally, but the heartland and the east part of Ireland remained pro-treaty, and the peripheral part. And you could sort of say that would be where the Fenian tradition would be stronger. It's the mountains of Donegal, Mayo, Galway, Clare, which is fairly flat, but down into West Limerick and Kerry and Cork. That's the Fenian territory and also remains the anti-treaty territory. So I think it's geographic and grudge within those communities rather than, but clearly in each of those divisions there were people who sided one way, and I heard of a marvelous Italian word, trazione, transformazione, which means it's a liberal way of you go with the wind, you go with the spirit, which is, well, you know, if your leader is going to go there, I'm not going to question what my leader says. I'm going to go that way. So brigades and even battalions within brigades broke off and followed different things. So it wasn't generational. I think it was just geographic, but also following leaders. Ring in Mayo went pro-treaty, and Kilroy and the others remained anti-treaty. Brennan, the same age as many of the other fellows from Clare, went pro-treaty. So I don't think it was a generational thing.
Yes, question.
If you see it more as geographical, no? The West being Fenian and the East being, say, status quo, right?
The Pale.
The Pale, exactly. But then the question remains, there is the great silence, the transformation, the winners take all, the church being defiantly sort of taking a side, and then history being rewritten or history being silenced. And that, well, could have been generational. I mean, it could have just been sort of the old ones who don't want that younger voice or the spirit of the younger rebel pushed aside. We will silence this, and heaven help you if you raise those terrible memories.
Well, I mean, this did happen, and I mean, McGahern has written beautifully about the various communities and where people stayed silent. Father's answer to the silence, I think, was go back and interview the comrades who had fought, and his answer to the silence was to get a record, so that the record, contrary to what had the Irish government done in their military archives, where you had people type up what people were saying, and people were commenting back, do you really mean that? Was this chronologically correct? What Father did in his 450 interviews for his comrades was to give the written statement, and those still haven't, though I've published a couple of books on them, those won't be out for another couple of years, but hopefully the Irish Manuscript Commission will publish them.
Ernie was clearly an extraordinary writer and archivist and historian, and let's just, here's the house, Borrishull Lodge in County Mayo, that they moved to 1938 to 45. Helen and Ernie, and 3 children were born there. And I guess you had very early memories, probably before you weren't born. Well, you were there till you were 3.
I remember before I was born. Now, that 9 months was very nice. I was fed constantly and taken care of. No, I mean, that was a great house. It was a house, actually, Father writes about, it was O'Malley property. You don't see the old castle that was built on that house, but it was, the castle fell into disrepair. The house that had been there, owned by the O'Malleys who participated in 1798, was torn down. And this house was rebuilt in about 1865 and went to sort of Anglo-Irish. And by the time Anketel Jones sold it, I think in 1903 to the District Board, it went into somewhat disuse. And father and mother were able to buy that rented in 1938. And we lived there. My mother didn't sell it till 1981. But that became the home. I mean, during the war, we had, De Valera had said to be self-sufficient. So my father, who was not a farmer and was not a good farmer when he became a farmer, but took up the diligence and hired local people and bought and expanded at least more land around the area, and employed 10 or 15 people, had beekeeping and beasts and wheat and everything but tea. And the bees fed into the sugar, so you didn't even have to buy sugar. But that was home. It was a beautiful home, and very gracious, and very fond memories.
Right. So, Mayo folklore. So tell us about his devotion to folklore and saving a lot of Irish folklore.
Well, he had been involved in folklore. I don't know where he learned it, but clearly as a teenager, he had read Irish folklore. And when he was in Clare in 1919, he went out to the Aran Islands with Paller Clancy. And he was telling stories in the Aran Islands of Irish as well as Norwegian folklore and Icelandic folklore. So he always had an interest. And when he met Ella Young in New Mexico in 1929, the first, I have the recorded diary from that night when he was there. They promised each other that when he went home, he would attend to Irish folklore. And so, fast forward to 1940, it's a hard winter's night and what to do in an Irish winter, which is pretty long. And he goes around and collects stories, some of which are here in New York University, and the others I've found recently in the Folklore Commission in Ireland. And so he had an interest in recording these so that, again, just like he did later in getting the story from his comrades, he wanted old Ireland to be vibrant and remembered.
And here we have Helen's photograph of the races at Carramore, and one of the many that she took. Wonderful picture.
Yeah, they enjoyed photography together. I mean, on the weekends when Father went back and was doing medical school, which he hated, but he did that sort of, I think, to satisfy the in-laws and perhaps his wife. But he got fed up with that, and he took her around Ireland in 1935, 6, and 7, and did this photography. In fact, he'd taken Paul Strand around Ireland for a whole month in 1935 when Paul was returning from Moscow to New York. He dropped by Ireland and was toured around Ireland by Ernie O'Malley. And we have letters from 1955 when we used to visit with Paul in Paris. And Paul writes and sort of said, you know, I've just finished a book on the Orkneys and on Italy and on France. Let's do one on Ireland. Sadly, for history and cultural sake, that just never came about. But we would have had Paul Strand's photographs of Ireland.
Would have been a counterpoint to The Quiet Man. So Jack B. Yeats, your father befriended him, the younger brother of the poet, and really helped him to get recognized as a modernist in the Irish tradition. And we have a picture here of the Jack B. Yeats, I guess was a launch. And of course, he also was a big fan of Louis Le Brocq, who was much younger. So a little bit about the paintings, and I know that you inherited some of them. Well,
yeah, he met Yeats and in 1937 in Dublin, and he, you know, Yeats was not well recognized in Ireland. It's sort of a historical fact that we don't really know because we think of himself and Le Brocq as being the artists, and so you think, well, they must always have been artists, but in fact, it wasn't until 1945 when Father and a group of people decided to give Jack B. Yeats an exhibition. It was called the National Loan Exhibition in the NCAD in Dublin in 1945. And he worked for about a year and a half. And again, in NYU, we have all of the files of the paintings that he went through, the people that he interviewed, the selection process of getting an exhibition together. And that was the first national exhibit of Yeats. It didn't go on tour, but they suddenly put Yeats in a status position. His paintings in those days were going for £250, which was, you know, in many people that was a year's salary. So, you know, whatever that salary is today, you'd say, are you going to spend a year's salary for a painting, which is just a piece of canvas with painting on it? Anyway, my father fell in love with a couple of those canvases and did, in fact, paint them and got to know him. And we have the correspondence again over at NYU of the letters that they would write back and forth with every payment of £10 each month that my father would pay.
And your father was also writing in The Bell, edited by Peadar O'Donnell.
So Seána Phelan and Peadar O'Donnell created The Bell in about 1939, 1940. And in fact, I found a reference in one of the letters with Frank Gallagher back in 1923 when Father was in jail. And they said, this is the type of journal that we need to put together that will have a discussion of art, of literature, of poetry, of theater. And that's in fact what O'Phelan and O'Donnell did. And when O'Donnell took over, he invited, and Father moved back to Dublin. He became an editor of The Bell, and it really was a very good journal for contemporary Irish arts at the time.
Same curls that he has. So this was, I guess, a difficult time for the marriage. They were beginning to go on the rocks a bit in 1946, two independent spirits. And they never divorced, I don't think, did they? Or did they ever divorce?
51.
But in that year, Helen kidnapped your two siblings, right? And brought them to America.
Yeah, so, I mean, the marriage had been going on the rocks. I think mother's health had not been good through her 3 pregnancies. She was up in Dublin, father was farming down in Mayo. They had significant correspondence, all of which was in my book, The Broken Landscape. But, they fell apart, and mother had gone into the theater, father had his own causes, and she took off in 47 to go to London to do the theater. She created the theater in 1944 with Irish actors, and her belief was, it's sort of an American belief following her own father, that you needed to pay people a proper wage in order to get them to work well. And so her thesis was that you needed to pay a person £1 a day so that they didn't need to keep a second job to be an actress, because an actor was so demanding a job. So she put the money up and created a theater. Anyway, by 47, 48, they were somewhat separated. And by 1940, late 48, she returned to America, where her family was. Her father had died by then, and she wanted to spend some time with her mother. And she was moaning about the loss of the children, one thing or another. And I think the American family sort of said, enough, go get them if you want them. And so she went back to Ireland, and my 2 older siblings were in boarding school. So it was easy enough to maneuver, taking them out of boarding school, driving a car to Belfast, hiring, like all of these things, all they need is a little money, and hiring a plane to fly to France. And by that time, the father was on to De Valera, who got on to de Gaulle. Anyway, they couldn't find him, and they flew on to Boston and took a train down to New York and went into the back door of the building.
That's what a story. So here, Cormac with his dad in Bar School, and okay, now we come to 1951. John Ford renews his friendship with Ernie from the early days, and so Ernie was an advisor on The Quiet Man and also The Rising of the Moon.
Well, Ford was, they must have met down in California in 1929 when he was there. And when Ford had always wanted to make, he'd not only made The Informer, but he wanted to make a color movie in Ireland. Technicolor had come around. So he had found the Walsh story, The Quiet Man, and wanted to make that into a movie. And basically, The Quiet Man was a family, not only a family movie, but a family affair, because Maureen O'Hara, beautiful red-headed Irish immigrant, was brought back. Her brothers, the Fitzsimons, were brought back to do location. John Wayne came back with his siblings and children. So we had and the father was an advisor. So we used to go down to Ashford Castle and watch what was going on in The Quiet Man. Unfortunately, my own role in The Quiet Man was cut. Very sad story.
Cormac was not the quiet man. All right, so, and then the Sunday Press ran this series on IRA raids, 1955-56.
So what Father had done in between, once my mother had left, she had basically sustained the family in terms of funding. And so Father needed additional funds, so he had to sell part of his library, part of his lands down in Mayo, and, so to speak, go to work like many other people. Having gone around the country to create this archive of 450 interviews, it was suggested that he could write articles about them. And so he went on to Radio Éireann and did some lectures, and then he went to the Sunday Press, and they published 55 Sundays, I think, of his articles.
So this was 1 year before his sad death, and here's a wonderful picture by Hazel Strand of him in 1956. Really lovely. And then he got a state funeral in Ireland in 1957. There hadn't been many before. Why do you think De Valera had just come back into power? Why do you think, I mean, he was obviously deserving of this, but it wasn't given to everybody. Why do you think De Valera laid on the state funeral?
Well, I don't even think that father was deserving of a state funeral. You know, what are state funerals about? Michael Collins got a state funeral. You know, Arthur Griffith got a state funeral. Douglas Hyde got a state funeral. I mean, these are for significant people who have participated in the political life of Ireland. So why did Ernie O'Malley, who was not elected to anything, had not done anything politically in Ireland? He had been a younger Republican. But so what was the cause célèbre in 1937? Well, I mean, my own conclusion on that is De Valera had always tried to get heroes on his side. And so father had stayed Sinn Féin in 1926 when Fianna Fáil was broken off. De Valera was after him to become a member of Fianna Fáil and accept as a role as a minister in 1935 when father came back, and father refused. And so my own sort of sarcastic view on this is De Valera couldn't get my father in life, and so he got him in death and gave him a state funeral. And so there could have been other elements which were going, you know, the border campaign was on, but we were getting to the point that, you know, militancy was going to rear its head again in Ireland. And I think De Valera wanted to get Ernie O'Malley in his camp rather than any other camp.
And here we have a shot of Sean Lemass, Eamon De Valera, and Frank Aiken, fellow Republicans from the old days. And this is quite a moving shot of the O'Malley family at the graveside in Glasnevin. Your father was only 60 or so when he died. And if you look at that slide, Cormac, behind you, you're there, that's your mother in the middle?
Yes.
And then your cousins were younger?
My sister and brother and cousins, my uncles, you can see Frank Aiken, tall, and Eamon De Valera. And on the right side of the screen, you can see Shanti O'Kelly,
yeah,
and Sean Moylan, who's giving the oration.
And yeah, what a gathering that was in Glasnevin. So, and you were 14 at that time?
Yes.
Okay, and a lot more adventures in your life, obviously, moving on. What a fascinating trajectory and story. I'm really grateful to you for bringing it to our attention. I want to take some more questions from the audience now.
We'll pass this mic as people have questions. Anybody?
Yeah, I read On Another Man's Moon 20 years ago, and I was very moved by it. My only question is, has your father ever spoken about influences? Because the style is almost as powerful as the subject.
Yeah, has my father ever spoken about literary influences on him?
Yes.
Well, I mean, I'm not a literary critic, but I understand that he's written in quite a modern way. And by that I mean that if you look at Hemingway and others, you don't need to tell a complete story. You know, and if you look at the style that he did, he had extensive dialogue, which is not usually part of history. He has descriptions of the countryside, which the American publishers, I was just reading the letters today in the NYU archives, thought archaic and romantic, you know. But they fulfill, and the Cuchulainn stories and the sagas, he feeds all of that as well as the folklore. And if you notice, in every 30 pages at the end of each chapter, he has a poem or a song or a ballad again, reflecting upon the ethos of the people. So he was really trying to not tell a history, as he says in the introduction. He was definitely trying to recreate, and give a sense of the movement itself, and the countryside, the people, the attitudes, and he wasn't too concerned with the facts. He did not cover all of Ireland. He only described what the Ireland that he knew.
You have another question over there, Mike? Just take the mic if you would.
It seems that every significant Irish writer from 1900 on was censored at some point by either the church or the government. That, from the little I know of your father, I don't think he ever ran into that, even when he was working for the Bell.
Ernie O'Malley as a writer was never sanctioned by the church. He was sanctioned by the church for other reasons, excommunicated, but not for, his subject matter was not the subject matter which you would ban. It was nationalism. So you might note that there are not too many women in the story, and that would have been an area that would have raised concerns by the church. And personal relationships were relatively a short shrift in the story. He was telling his own voyage around Ireland, so no particular reason to censor it, and it never occurred.
I think your father would have been very proud of your work in the early 1970s in helping to put together the Senate and congressional hearings that Senator Kennedy chaired in 1972. And the papers now, the British government papers, revealed that those hearings had a major impact on the British government, so much so that they ended the Stormont government, much hated Stormont government, and introduced the Sunningdale Agreement later that year, which gave a role to the Irish government. So in many ways you carried on the vision that he had to bring a degree of agreement and peace to Ireland. Just a quick question. You've always advocated, I think, for the peaceful negotiation of an agreed Ireland. You just think the times had changed from the early part of the century?
Well, if you look at it in perspective, home rule was achieved without military force. So, from starting in 1886 and 85 of those elections, it's just so remarkable that the English people throughout the English-speaking world, namely England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, were voting on the issue of home rule in 1886. So, that was a peaceful transition under a civilian government in Ireland and England, where you didn't need to fight. A vote was taken and it was going through. Well, now, guess who did fight, or who put up a fight? It was not the people in the future Republic of Ireland. It was people north of the border. Father fought for what he needed to do at the time. But he also did not take up the gun in later years. He did not join the campaign of, De Valera banned the IRA in the emergency, the Second World War. There was a border campaign, and Father was not supportive of that. By that time, he had just gone into culture. Yeah. From my own perspective, I was very satisfied with the work done by the American Committee for Also Justice at the conclusion of our hearings on February 28, 9, and March 1 of 1972, and even hilariously happy because 6 weeks after that, the British brought in direct rule in Northern Ireland, and my sense of what needed to be done after that was, I was not in favor of continued American meddling in Ireland. I said, let the Irish work it out. And this is, I'm delighted to hear of the impact that those hearings had. And guess, by the way, how many people or television stations were outside the hearing doors? The BBC was the only one. Wow. And it was the BBC direct feedback, what we were trying to do, because this is what had happened under Wilson in the trying to get to the peace agreements in 1919. It was the American influence on the British which helped bring about the truce, and so that was the ambition. And my view was, once we did that, it should be up to the Irish to formulate, with our advice if needed, on constitutional law and how to do it, but the Irish needed to...
And so it happened in the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. Loretta Brennan-Luxman, our chair.
Thanks, Ted. I'm going to deflate the level of the conversation from the heights that Cormac always hits. I'd just like to know more about your parents as people. Were they competitive, one with the other, when Ernie turned his significant interest towards arts and culture? Was there a competitive streak there between them that was observable to you children?
No, ironically enough, I mean, there were Tweedledee and Tweedledum in the arts. Mother was an artist and father was sort of an art historian. So father could explain whence my mother came to her art and could put her art into perspective, which she had not gone to college, she hadn't studied art, so she had no international background and context into which to put her own art. And so she was fascinated by this well-traveled man. She was fairly well-traveled herself, but she was traveling in her own world, which was when she went to Russia, she was in 1928, she was painting. When she went to Greece and danced in 1931 for a year in Athens on the Parthenon, she was dancing. So she was an active person in her art. And what father was able to bring to her was this perspective of where she stood and what they did. And so they greatly enjoyed music and art museums and photography and looking at ancient Ireland as they did. So when they went out to do these photographs, he was able to explain to her as an artist, you know, what the origin and what the history was. So I don't think they were ever in the early years competitive. And I mean, mother always wanted to get, you know, the books published of their photography. She talked to Faden in London in 1953, and she asked my father to help in the reconciliation process, you know, and he had no interest in being reconciled at that time. He just had a major heart attack, and you know, it was too much to have with her. But no, it was not competitive, very compatible.
Well, thank you, although I worry about a mansplaining to one's wife. I must say at this stage, we've had a fascinating evening, thanks to Cormac. It's been a wonderful journey through a momentous period in Irish history, Irish art, Irish culture, and we're really indebted to you for all you've done, not just tonight, but in your records, your archives, and your commitment to Luxman Island House, and how clever it was of Loretta to bring you in as the first president. It was really, really a great thing. So let's give a round of applause to Cormac. Thank you.
Thank you.